Good afternoon from the Kennedy Greenhouse studio. My name is Chloe Findlay. With Election Day less than 24 hours away, it is important that students understand the magnitude of this election, especially because this will be the first time many students are casting a vote for president. Joining me today is USC Political Science instructor Joshua Meyer-Gutbrod, or more affectionately known as Dr. MG, to discuss the election and what students should keep an eye on. Dr. MG, welcome.
Thank you.
We're very happy to have you here.
Happy to be here.
So obviously this is a big election for us. Politics have been a little bit more polarized than in previous years. So I want to start off with, why do you think in particular that voting in this election is so important?
Well, there's so much going on in this election. First and foremost, we have a major presidential election on our hands. We've essentially sort of got one incumbent from 2 years ago and someone from the incumbent party currently running with Vice President Harris and former President Trump. And there's a lot at stake, and their emotions are running high in terms of the polarization, but there's also a lot of policy at stake in the different approaches these candidates are going to have to how the federal government is going to interact with constituents across the country.
Yeah, what do you think has contributed to some of the polarization in politics in the past couple of years? So
we've been seeing polarization increasing. It really starts picking up in the early 90s and really ramps up in the early 2000s. And we're starting to see sort of a different side of it, where a lot of it has to do less with the outcomes of government and the actual policy changes, and more with a lot of rhetoric and trying to mobilize voters. And so there's a lot of thought that goes behind how candidates talk and what they say to try and get all of you to turn out to vote. Creating bigger distances between candidates and what they're going to present and the options they're going to have can help mobilize people, as well as sort of creating this emotional edge. And whenever you're confronted with that, it's important to separate those two things and really think about the emotion, but also think about these really substantial policy differences that matter.
Yeah, do you think that some of those emotions will die down once the new president is selected, or do you think it will only increase?
Political scientists have been struggling to predict anything over the last 10, 15 years. So much is changing with the electorate. Things are changing with the media, things are changing with how voters behave. And the parties are shifting in terms of their stances and what they're pushing for. So it's going to be really hard to say. And so I think if things die down, I think my takeaway would be they're going to die down because we as citizens change what we're looking for. We think differently about the election. We start to think about more about substance and policy and less about us and them. And that's what's going to create that change, because candidates, when they're presenting their message, they want to win, right? That's what they're out there for. And so they're going to give people what they want. They're going to give people the story they want. And we as voters have to think, how can we get a different story out of them?
Yeah, and talking about making predictions, obviously with the two candidates right now, the polls say that they are very close together. However, there are people that are skeptical of the polls and don't necessarily think that they give an accurate representation of the standing of the two candidates. What do you have to say about that?
I think the polls have gotten really hard because we've entered a period where people are voting more, and we don't quite know who's going to vote. I remember when I was in college, we were reading this book called The Vanishing Voter, and it was talking about how nobody votes, and that was 2004. And the world has changed dramatically, and people are voting in much higher numbers, and we don't quite know who's turning out exactly. And that's what the polls rely on. When we're taking small samples, we really want to make our best guess as to who's going to turn out that election day, and we really don't know. And so I would agree that I think there's reason to be skeptical of the polls, and it has a lot to do with this changing political environment, so it could swing either way. There's a lot of other factors people are looking at in terms of primary voter turnout, in terms of spending and money, in terms of sort of latent publics, and those all point in different directions. I think at the end of the day, we really don't know. We don't know based on the polls, and we don't know based on a lot of other factors. So it really remains to be seen as to who turns out, which is why voting on Tuesday or in early voting is so important.
Why is it that you think within the past couple of years the number of voters, especially young voters, has increased?
I think some of it is the emotional appeals. A lot of it is that issues are getting thrust back into the public. Issues that young people are interested in And for better and worse, they're getting politicized. And so things, abortion is now back on the ballot, talking about things like climate change being on the ballot, talking about things, all these other things that are sort of high ticket items are getting engaged with in the presidential debates in ways and the presidential election and national elections in ways that they maybe weren't as talked about, or at least as front and center 20 years ago. And so young people are getting more invested. I also think there's more information out there for young people. It's easier to do some looking up and understand where the candidates sit. And we're just seeing higher participation rates across the board. People are watching the presidential debates in ways that they didn't 20 years ago, or at least not as higher rate.
Yeah. What do you think, maybe policy-wise, maybe not policy-wise, what do you think students should be focused on, specifically with this election and going to cast their vote?
So obviously there's some really important national issues on the ballot this year. And the parties are sort of making their pitches in different directions in terms of everything from abortion to immigration to student loan forgiveness, public funding for that, even taxes and how we structure our tax system are all on the national ballot and really important. Students here in South Carolina face an interesting dilemma because the odds of South Carolina shifting partisan control either for the state legislature or in the presidential race is fairly low. It's not impossible, nothing's impossible, but it's fairly low. And so I think there always needs to be a little bit of additional impetus to go vote. And there are a lot of issues within state politics that really matter. And so one of the things I study is state politics and state political rhetoric and how states look different. And there are so many things that the South Carolina state legislature has a tremendous impact on students, ranging from your tuition to school infrastructure to housing situations that students should really be paying attention to within the state that are a really good reason to get out and vote in addition to the presidential election.
I do think that state politics, especially among students, is very much overlooked because they think all of the, I guess a lot of students might believe that the state level doesn't really have much to do with the laws that they see implemented and how it affects their lives. So in regards to state politics, how do you think students should approach looking at those? Should they look at them with a deeper lens, or?
I think it's worth paying attention to the candidates. I mean, like I said, the partisan distribution of the chamber is not going to change, but that is not how states operate, right? They get away from that partisanship very quickly, very easily, and they start to think about the real practical effects of governance. And there are things like thinking critically about tuition. We've been able to slow tuition increases by and large over the last few years, but the state's probably going to have to tighten its budget in the next 4 years. We've had a big influx of federal money that has increased our ability to keep that tuition flat. In addition, there's a lot of state and even local, especially if you're in a city that's holding local elections this year. Richland has county elections, but not city elections. Those guys have a tremendous impact on housing. And they're worth paying attention to, things like how they regulate Airbnb, how they think about high-rises within local communities, how they regulate quality of living for apartment buildings. All of that can come down to state and local offices that can have a really big impact on students. And paying attention to who are those House and Senate members at the state level and also local elected officials that are going to really advocate for students and what their needs are.
In your professional opinion, how informed do you think students and maybe just local young people are about our state and national politics?
So generally speaking, students look a lot like everybody else. We tend to be fairly highly informed about national issues. Now, often that comes with a fairly partisan lens where people become informed on issues that they care about because they fall in one of those Republican or Democratic identity camps. They think of themselves as a partisan. They want to hear that partisan message. And so they sort of take in that information that is affiliated with that party, whether it's through campaigns, whether it's through selecting their news sources, all that. And generally speaking, people tend to be lower informed on the issues at the state and local level, unless you have a really vested interest, right? If you're a local business owner, you're really following the city council. You really care about that. Or you're really following the state legislature, and you're probably working with lobbyists or various other groups to really interact with them at a high rate. The average voter doesn't follow that stuff as much, and it's really problematic because that's where a lot of the action is happening. At the federal level, we're looking, the presidential race obviously is going to have a major impact. However, whatever way it slices, we're probably looking at best, a very, very tight House and Senate. Certainly not filibuster proof, and more likely we're looking at divided government, right? And so the federal government, under those conditions, can be fairly limited. They're still doing stuff. They're talking about it less. They're still doing bipartisan stuff, but they're talking about it less. But there's a lot of stuff that they can't touch. And that's where states can really shine. And paying attention to what they're doing becomes really important. It can also be challenging because of a lack of local news coverage as sort of local newspapers decline, but it's still really important to get out there and see what they're saying.
Yeah, why, talking about the importance of students really paying attention to politics, why then do you think it is important for students to vote? Because in talking to a couple of people, I have noticed that some students don't really understand the importance of casting their vote in the election. They think they maybe don't matter, or that they're a smaller population. What is your opinion on why young people should go out to the polls?
Oh, everybody should go out to the polls because it's, as a nation, our best way to register what the population is thinking, right? In terms of all the big ticket items nationally, right? In terms of these sort of different agendas, which way is the nation leaning in terms of those agendas? But locally, it's even more important because there's a lot of local races that are decided by a coin flip because it's a tie race, right? This is not uncommon. And there's a lot of local races that could swing if more people turned out in those elections. And these become really important. So thinking critically about how those local races might impact you and getting out for those as well as the big ticket items to sort of send a broader signal about where the nation is heading can be really important. And I'll add to that, young people have a really unique perspective. It's been such a pleasure teaching you all and seeing that the sort of push against polarization from young people. You guys are tired of the polarized political environment. You've grown up with it in a way that people in my generation, we saw the pre-polarized environment. We've seen, you know, the bipartisanship that can occur outside of it. You guys haven't, and you're tired of it. And so pushing against that, it can be really important with your unique perspective.
Well, thank you, Dr. MG. I appreciate you coming on to discuss some of these things with us. If you are a registered voter in South Carolina, make sure you hit the polls tomorrow on Election Day to make your voices heard. For SGTV, I'm Chloe Findlay.